Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're continuing with my exposition of my translation of Genesis. We've come to chapter 14, where Abraham will deliver Lot. I will read first verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, with Shinab, king of Admah, with Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and with the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these gathered together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. And they had served Kedorlaomer 12 years, but in the 13th year they rebelled. Just one thing to comment on here. It mentions the Salt Sea, or the Dead Sea. Of course, that was the result of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that did not yet exist at this moment in time. But Moses, writing centuries later, gives us this clarification. That's all. Now let's read verses 5 through 12. In the 14th year of Kedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him came and struck the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and struck all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hizazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they set the battle in array against them in the valley of Siddim. Against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the rest fled to a mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and departed. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. I just want to comment here in verse 5, the Rephaim, Zuzim, and Emim were hybrid races, like the Nephilim, demon with woman. Now, you may have wondered about all those names, like why did the Holy Spirit lead Moses to record the names of peoples and places in such detail and precision? Like, what sense would it make? Or difference would it make centuries later, not to mention millennia later? Well, I answer because God's written revelation has always been a historical and true record, not a religious book. The enemies of the Bible, oh, it's a no, it's a historical record. That's why. Now let's read verses 13 through 16. But one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, Eshcol's brother and Aner's brother. They were Abram's allies. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he led out his 318 trained men born in his house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Then he, that's Abram, divided his servants and attacked them by night and smote them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is on the left side of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods and also brought his brother Lot with his goods. as well as the women and the people. For the moment, here we read Abram the Hebrew. This is the first occurrence of the word Hebrew, which became the patronymic of Abraham and his descendants. Here in verse 14, Abram heard that his brother, well, of course, that's the Latu sensu, Lot being his nephew. However, it is likely that they felt like brothers, being about the same age, more or less, and having been raised together probably in Ur, because Lot's father was probably a whole lot older than Abram. Now then, the 318 trained men. It says very plainly that they were born in Abram's house. So they were not mercenaries. Well, no. With women and children and old men and whatnot, the community that Abram led probably numbered at least 1,000 people. And that's a lot of people. You got to feed that many. On the other hand, with so many men capable of war, taking action against him, Abram probably wasn't all that good idea, probably a bit risky. Abram did not stay at home. He commanded the operation. I like that. That's a good deal. Abram was out in front. Talks here about the left side of Damascus. Well, since they were heading north, the left would be the west side of Damascus. Now, it is obvious that God helped Abram, all right? Because the four kings would presumably have had more men, a good many more men than Abram. But let's think about it a bit. Hebron was only about 40 kilometers from Salem, that's Jerusalem. Did Abram not know anything about Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God? I imagine that Abram had asked God's blessing through Melchizedek, which is why then he tithed. It is also obvious that Abram's interest was to rescue Lot, not the others. And God helped Abram, even though God knew that what would happen to Lot later. Maybe God was giving Lot one last chance to correct his life. He should have left Sodom at that moment. In fact, he should never have gone there, for that matter. Okay, now let's read verses 17 through 24. That'll finish chapter 14. And when Abram had returned after striking Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought bread and wine. And he was priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, that is to say, Melchizedek blessed Abram, and said, Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, owner of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the people and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand to Jehovah, the Most High God, owner of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread to a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. Nothing for me, only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. For the moment, obviously, the king of Sodom had not been either killed or taken prisoner. But I ask, what was Melchizedek doing so far from Jerusalem? How did he know when and where Abram was coming? I have no doubt that there was supernatural involvement. Hebrews 7, 1 through 7 gives us an inspired commentary on this meeting between Melchizedek and Abram. The figure of Melchizedek is a bit of a mystery, since he is priest of the Most High. How is it that such an office has never been spoken of before? And how is it that Abram submitted to him without objection? And where did the idea of tithing come from? Well, now, if Melchizedek was a manifestation of Jehovah, that would be Jehovah the Son, who had appeared to Abram before, then Abram's attitude was natural, like he might have recognized. Hebrews 7:7 says, "Now without dispute the lesser is blessed by the greater." End quote. Obviously, therefore, Melchizedek was greater than Abram because Melchizedek blessed Abram. In verse 22, Abram repeats the titles of God given by Melchizedek, but he adds God's personal name, Jehovah. This is interesting. Abram said that he had raised, that's before, he had raised his hand before leaving. I conclude that he had certainly asked for God's help. Just how he did it, I don't know, but it would appear so. Now, Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, was happy to get the people back and told Abram to keep the goods. But Abram said, "No way, thank you." Of course, Abram was already very rich. He did not need anything else. Further, anything from Sodom would be contaminated by the utterly wicked life of the inhabitants. It would not be such a good thing to have around. Now then, obviously, Abram didn't go alone. He had men from Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. We are not told how many men they had, but they would have been added to Abram's 318. And notice that although Abram didn't want anything for himself, he recognized that those three men had a right to some of the spoil. So he insisted on that. Now let's go on to chapter 15, where God is going to deal with Abraham. We'll read verses 1 through 6. After these things, the word of Jehovah came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be exceedingly great." Then Abram said, "Oh, Lord Jehovah, what will you give me, since I am still childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" Then Abram said, "Really, you have given me no descendant. Indeed, one born in my house will be my heir." Then the word of Jehovah came to him, saying, "This one will not be your heir, but he who will come out of your own body, he shall be your heir." Then it's God, took him outside and said, "Look now toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he, that's Abram, believed Jehovah, and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. For the moment. How about this exceedingly great reward? What in the world? Must have been in heaven. Here on earth, Abraham was already very rich. He didn't need any more. And his problem was he didn't have any son, and he appeals to that fact. In verse 5, it says that God took him outside. In that case, God was there. The first verse, God used a vision, but apparently from verse 4 on, God materialized. He was physically present. Also, for God to show him the stars. It had to be at night, okay, to see the stars. Now, Abraham didn't have any sons yet, and God tells him he's going to have descendants like the stars. And verse 6 says that he believed Jehovah, and Jehovah reckoned it to him for righteousness. Well, you know, that took some believing, all right. Now let's read verses 7 through 11. We're still in chapter 15. Then Jehovah said to him, I am Jehovah who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, that is Abram, my Lord Jehovah, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So he brought all these to him and cut them in two, and he placed each half opposite the other. But he did not divide the birds. And the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. A couple of things here. In verse 8, Abram asks, how shall I know? In verse 6 says that he believed, but here he asked for confirmation. The cruel truth was that he was still childless. In verses 13 to 16, God will give a more detailed answer. Not yet. Abraham questioned God and he answered, but the experience was not pleasant. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now in verse 10, it says that Abram cut those animals in half. I take it that he did it from top to cutting them in half from front to back, which of course would be more difficult than just simply cutting across. Presumably God had told him to kill the animals in that way, but they were not burned. So it was not a normal offering. It was not a burnt sacrifice. Now in verse 11, for the birds of prey to be coming on, that's because it was during the day, and presumably that was the immediately following day, that is after the visions that he'd had at night. That kept Abram busy, probably. Now let's go on and read verses 12 through 21, and that's going to be the end of chapter 15. And it happened, when the sun was going down, that a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a terrible and dense darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will be enslaved and mistreated, for 400 years. But I also will judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with great wealth. And you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the measure of the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. End quote. And it came to pass, when the sun had set and it was dark, that behold, a smoking portable stove and a torch of fire that passed between those halves. That same day Jehovah made a covenant with Abram, and saying, I have given this land to your descendants, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, including the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Let's go back and check a few things here. Now we have a continuation of the bit about the animals that he had cut in half and so on. It says here that there was a terrible and dense darkness. That must have been very unpleasant, an unusual darkness. And of course, the prophecy he was about to hear was also going to be dark. Verse 13 has received its share of bad treatment. It has generally not been understood. The verse should be understood as a chiasmus, a common structure in the Bible. So A, B, B, A. So it goes A, your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs. B, and will be enslaved. B, and mistreated. Then you go back to A for 400 years. A careful comparison of the relevant passages shows that the 400 years include from Isaac's weaning to the Exodus. That's from 1891 to 1491, precisely 400 years. Since Jacob moved to Egypt in 1706, Abram's descendants were foreigners in Canaan for 185 years. And then they were foreigners in Egypt, where they were enslaved, for 215 years. The Exodus occurred 144 years after Joseph's death, so the period of slave labor must have been somewhat less, perhaps around 100 years. By the way, I owe that analysis to Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones. In verse 14, God says that he's going to judge the nation, and he did that. He judged Egypt with some severity, actually. And then God says that they're going to come out with great wealth. Well, that's true too. If you go to Exodus 12, verses 35 and 36, it records that the Israelites plundered the Egyptians, taking away a great deal of wealth, in fact. Verse 15, before your fathers in peace, good old age. Well, in fact, Abraham, then he died peacefully at the age of 175. That's in Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 and 8. Now then, the 4 generations that will return here. Verse 15 recounts Abram's death. So the 4th generation of verse 16 must be reckoned after that death. Jacob was born well before his grandfather's death, and therefore the calculation must begin with a son of his. I understand that the 4 generations were 1, Levi, who lived 137 years, Kohath, who lived 133 years, Amram, who lived 137 years, and Moses, who lived 120 years. You'll find that in Exodus chapter 6, verses 16 to 20. In that text, only the first 3 are given a record of the years they lived. It's Exodus 6. No one else, just those 3, which was certainly on purpose. God did that on purpose so we could figure that out. So I understand anyway. Now in verse 16, this one really bothers me. Because he says, God can't give the land to him then because the measure of the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. That leaves me rather melancholic. You know, is there a measure of wickedness for every evildoer? Do countries have a measure of wickedness? A Congress that has already filled barrels with corruption. And there's no point in praying against it. No, notice that God himself declared that the measure was not full, which means that God knew the point at which it would be full. And he was not going to shorten the interval. Oh dear. Well, it's the sovereignty of God in action, okay? Now, the Amorites were descendants of Canaan, whom Noah had cursed. Perhaps the curse resulted in a certain measure of iniquity. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, that's within the 10 Commandments. It says that God himself, quote, visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Well, does God determine a measure for the iniquity? I confess that I would like to understand this subject better, but to this day I've not found a better explanation. That one really bothers me. I don't like that one. Now we come back to the animals and all that. The sun has set. It was dark. Behold, a smoking portable stove and a torch of fire that passed between the halves. We are not told what the purpose of the stove and torch may have been. For that matter, we are not told the purpose of the whole procedure. However, I asked the Holy Spirit to illumine me about the episode. I do that when I don't understand the text. And this is what came to me. This is probably not an interpretation, but I suggest it as an application. The animals represent projects that we undertake on behalf of Christ's kingdom, like sacrifices. The heifer stands for big ones, the goat and ram for middle-sized ones, and the birds for small ones. Any 3-year-old animal is mature, full-grown, so the projects are in effect. The buzzards represent Satan's servants who work to contaminate and diminish what we have achieved. And like Abraham, we have to keep alert to try to stop them. Then there are times when God puts us in the dark without explanation, which is very unpleasant. I have been there a time or two. Isaiah chapter 50, verses 10 and 11 refers to this. It says, don't light your own fire. The stove will burn some of the contamination, and the torch will expose the extent of the damage. They are things that God does. As it came to me, I take it as serves as an application, not the interpretation. I don't know what the interpretation is. Now in verse 18, it talks about the river of Egypt. That is not the Nile. It's a small stream south of Gaza. Verse 18 also mentions by name the river Euphrates. As far as we know, the people of Israel never at any time occupied that entire area, not to the river Euphrates, not even David or Solomon. I ask, is it a reference to the millennial messianic kingdom? Until then, God had promised Canaan, but now he increased the size. During the millennium, it will be there. Hold on. Now then, this is interesting about all these, no less than 10 ethnic groups are mentioned here by name. One of them, by the way, is hybrid, the Rephaim, hybrid race. But obviously, I take it that it's the land that those groups occupied that God was giving, not the people. It was the land that they occupied. And that is chapter 15, and that is where we're going to stop this video. Thanks for watching, and God bless.